Ferguson, who wrote the book Politics of the Mind, Marxism and Mental Distress. And I think it's a book which is really important. It's a small book, but I think it really puts our perspective down as far as mental health and mental distress, and what it means as socialists, and what we have to say about it. And if I can give at least 1% justice to what Ian's wrote, I'll try really, because I don't think there's any. One of the things when I first got into mental health, it is an interesting field, and sometimes there's no right and wrong answers. It's a field whereby there's debates, there's discussion, and actually there's no evidence. Actually, sometimes things actually work, like antidepressants and everything else. So it is quite an interesting field, and also I think the wording mental distress I'm going to use, people use mental illness, etc., will feel like that's too more like the medical model. So I'll just use mental distress. It might fall into mental illness, because actually when you work in the mental health field, people talk about mental illness all the time. But even though I'm going to be slightly more abstract talking about mental health, I just want to say one thing. Naila's sitting here, and I want to say something about Naila, about mental health. And the reason I'm saying this is because many years ago, and a number of times I've found her up at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, she'll know this, and I work in A&Es. And I'm using this example because it's an example of actually, even though we're talking wider, how you can actually support people locally, and thousands of people in mental health are trying to help people. In situations of chaos, of a production line, of targets, people are trying their best. So one of the things I'm going to say, we had a situation, I don't know if Nana remembers this, I had somebody, obviously confidentiality, I won't say which hospital, somebody in the hospital, a number of years ago, who had tried to kill themselves, tried to suicide, really distressed. Only to find out he had a bag of papers. If you remember this, he had a bag of papers, right? From a Middle Eastern country. This Middle Eastern country, had revolution, counter-revolution, which we know because politics, because of racism, we understand those things. And what actually happened is, I found out in this bag, the following day, it looked like he was going to get deported, wasn't it? And I looked and we looked at the doctors saying, what we're going to do? But I knew Naila, you know what I mean? And the reason why I'm saying that is because Naila's anti-racist, anti-fascist, and I knew that she would know somebody who could support this individual. The following day, rather than actually give him a pill, or actually give him an antidepressant, or lock him up on the wall, he went to see Naila. Is that right? This individual, I believe, you supported, and he did get deported, from what I understand. Is that right? Is that fair to say? Now, I'm saying that. Why it's important? Because across the services, across the reviews in children's, in mental health, this government is talking about changing the way I do things, and a lot of people like us do things. There's a big review in children's, which you know about, from a guy based in entrepreneur who organised it at the front line of private organisation called All Children's. And basically the review was saying, we don't want to talk about racism or culture or this poverty. It's a technical thing. It's families bothered, and you go in with motivation interviews, and you're always going to be worried about families because they could always be abusing their kids, and you go into the family and you organise the family and separate everything else. Been a bit cynical there, but that seems to me what the outcome with children's work is, the outcome of that review. So actually, what this government wants is not for me not to find that, for me not to do that. What this government wants is for me to give this guy a pill, go off and get deported to Rwanda now, probably. You know what I mean? Which probably would happen now. But many people like myself in spaces are trying to challenge that, and I believe that. At the same time is, how I want to look at the meeting, and how I want to see it is from the point of view of what's happening today, about the RO2 strike, about the possible upturn of the summer of unrest. if you like, the sort of possibly giving, for the first time in many years, our class some confidence to challenge and fight back. And I have to say, one of the best things for my mental health is seeing Mick Lynch have a go at them, you know what I mean? Well, we think of Mick Lynch, my mental health is better than he says, it's this top of society, it's cost of living, and it's, God, that does my mental health a lot of good. I tell you, it does my mental health a lot of good at all. Keir Starmer depresses me. He depresses me, just blaming the active individual, having a go, obviously he's a terrible person, all this, but in the end, it's just individualisation, everything else we get. What happens, actually what happens and what the government's trying to push in mental health. Atomising people, blaming the individual, blaming it for their mental health is their own fault. And look about, I mean, many commentators have talked about what they call epidemic of mental health. And actually this is true, and actually people aren't talking about COVID now. COVID had a massive effect. I was seeing people in A&Es who basically were never had come to services before. A lot of young people who quite very isolated, lost that contact, and people for the first time in absolutely traumatic situations. And when I say traumatic, there's loads of evidence actually trauma, actually mental health. It's been seen as a real big factor and actually linked to developing the brain and all sorts of things from early childhood. So people were traumatised after COVID. And so what has happened? So before COVID, 11% of adults aged between 16 and 39 reported depressive symptoms. This increased to 29% due to COVID, after COVID. I assume it's COVID. The study done this week on antidepressants says in 2021 to 22 that basically there's been 500,000 people more put on antidepressants. So 8.3 million people have been received that 8.3 million people as antidepressants prescribed to them in the last year. That's a lot of people, a lot of people. At the same time, austerity, welfare cuts, has had a massive effect on people's mental health. It's not just us on the left who say that. The ONS study says that basically the more poor you are, the more effect it has on depression and actual mental health. Reports on welfare cuts is actually important. And to be honest, if you give somebody £20 to take it off them, what psychological effect is that going to have? It's not because it's there, therefore you give them medication. The issue is you're taking the 20 quid off them. An absolute disgrace. What effect is that actually going to have on people? And I'll put it out, there's a study done at Liverpool University, and they looked at the fear and anxiety of people on benefits, particularly for disabled people. And what did they say? Put it out to people, what do you think they said was the biggest fear in life? People who are disabled, what do you think? What do you think the biggest fear? What when the study showed for people who was disabled, what was the biggest fear?
Brown envelope.
Yeah, you know, it's in the study. The fear of the brown envelope. And the reason what was the fear of the brown envelope is because it's about reviewing the benefits. They're constantly on review, constantly thinking that it's not living in a go. Imagine that on top of that with the cost of living crisis, how that is going to affect the people. Absolutely disgraceful. Many studies, like the spirit level, show about inequality and the direct effect on mental distress. And neoliberalism has compounded the inequalities of oppression society. Plus, COVID has made it worse, especially for black and ethnic minority people, where people are more dying from ethnic minority backgrounds because of COVID. And embracing homophobia, sexism and other oppressions shape our everyday experience. You're more likely to die of COVID. If you actually, there's been a report done on the NHS Race Health Observatory which noted that ethnic minorities within health and the NHS, if you're black, you're more likely to be sectioned, even less access to service. That report came out 3 months ago. So that is happening, that's been happening for years. I used to work in security union, I worked in the security union, and the amount of people disproportionate from black and ethnic minority background in security is very hard. You know, that there is institutionalised racism. But what the report found the group who deal with, often the group who actually deal with people who've got mental health difficulties who first see people in mental distress, were found to be the most racist and the most sexist, and that was the police. So, some of the most oppressed groups, I'm going to mention one oppressed group, I'm going to mention one oppressed group, because when Liz Truss, and they have an argument about the gender wars, when they are arguing about gender wars in Parliament, and they're talking, it's like some abstract thing, and they're going on, and even the most moderate of them has to show how reactionary they are, because they're 160,000 people, are so reactionary they're going to go to. I think it can be funny, but it's a disgrace. And why is it a disgrace? Because actually what it does to people, particularly transgender people, is that actually for transgender people the high levels of attempted suicide is actually massive. For instance, for trans people, several studies have shown that 40% or more have attempted suicide at least once in a lifetime. That isn't because of some medical, biological. That is because these buggers are spreading the gender specific, all this rubbish they're talking about on the TV, filters down, and they're being discriminated against. That's what that's about, completely. It's an absolute disgrace. At the same time, though, even though services in crisis, services become like a production line, you don't have time, you have targets, you go to A&E, I don't know if you've been to A&E if you're a worker, but just if you go to North Manchester, if it's still there, or they've got a big board up. This big board says what time you see your patient, what time you kick him out, what time you do this. You get people coming in, you see people, what time you're going to finish. Time is everything to what's going on in the services. And actually, it's awful for people. And what I'm going to say is, even though it's awful, even though we've got all this, people are still struggling to try and work with people in all sorts of ways. But I want to say about, considering 1 in 4 of us are likely to get severe mental distress this year, which statistics are showing, I want to just look about what has actually gone on in that last number of years in mental health. Mental health funding has been cut each year by 8% since 2011. Community and talking therapy is affected the most. Children's services cut by 1/3. We think the mental health challenges in NHS care and social care can no longer provide basic services. The study by Rose showed people ending up at A&E as an emergency has gone up 50%. At the same time, hospitals beds have been reduced by 25% since 2010. And often people have to travel miles to even get a bed. And NSPCC say 150 children died and had access to mental health services. I mean, what an absolute disgrace. But on top of this, on top of the cuts, on top of austerity, we've had to put with marketisation and neoliberalism, which basically has created a situation in work in health or social services like a production line, like a factory. And when I hear Liz Truss turn around and say that she wants to deregulate everything, well, that's what Thatcher said. And we know about deregulation, all sorts of things. But when you actually have somebody like Milton Friedman, who's Thatcher's guru, who actually said he wants to deregulate all drugs, so we have no regulation of drugs at all. He wrote an article about that because the market decides, his view, Thatcher's view, although she couldn't quite get away with it, she semi-privatised the agencies. What actually his view was that you have no regulation, and what you do, you give every drug on the market, and if people suffer, you sue. That was his answer. And that is the sort of things what people are actually following today with the leadership of the Tories and across the board, really. I mean, I want to just go further and look at actually the relationship actually between what's the sort of people fighting back generally in the class struggle. That's why the RMT is so important. And also the progressive ideas what's come out in mental health. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, mental health has dominated what people call the medical model. And then there was treatments like, even going back to the 20s, 30s, and malaria treatments, insulin, electric shock treatments. People were put into asylums. But this was often challenged when there actually was a general rising class struggle. And I want to argue that some of the progressive areas what came out of the challenges to Italy and other places to the asylums and the sort of over-paternalist ideas of everything else in mental health. There's a relationship between that and the class struggle in America of the 60s and 70s, where black people were fighting back and fighting over gender and everything else. And there's a link between the two. Around this time, there's a challenge in critical psychology. You had people like Lang, who talked about mental health just being a social issue. I don't quite agree with all that, but there was a backlash to the idea that it's just your fault, some medical problem you have. People like Goffman talked about power relationships with silence and how bad, Provence with Cuckoo's literally, how bad actually that was. And actually around this time the service user movement started, around about in 1973. The Paddington Day Hospital was the first patients' union, and many other organisations like the Hearing Voices has developed since. And the slogan, "Nothing about without us," was very important, and all that developed around the 60s and 70s, and carried on. And actually, the service user movement has actually been backbone for many years of some of the reasons we haven't quite got the draconian legislation we could have now. The difficulty was when the class struggle goes up, it also come down. Thatcher defeated the miners, in Reagan it was the air traffic controllers. And actually the way they fought back was actually develop a model of psychiatry, which when I first come in, I never knew there weren't that many diagnoses around. Now there's thousands of diagnoses. And they developed what they called the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, which everyone in the field knows as DSM. They're doing assessments of mental health, they follow it like everything. In fact, the DSM is the biggest selling book, one of the biggest selling books in history. And why is it one of the biggest selling books in history? Because it gave free to all the pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceuticals would buy it, and then they give it free out to everybody, so everybody, all the psychiatrists can follow it in community mental health and everything else, and it becomes that type of process. And Ian Ferguson, who wrote this book, argues that DSM had an impact both materially and ideologically. So drug companies look for drugs that fit categories. Psychiatrists who develop DSM, basically around schizophrenia and mood disorders, had 100% links with Big Pharma. And in fact, actually, some of the diagnoses are quite bizarre. In fact, I think if I had a diagnosis of everybody here today, I think I would say you've got oppositional defiant disorder. And you think I'm joking, that is a category where some people might know it is a category of DSM. So hopefully, proudly, you will have that diagnosis. That James Davies, who doesn't come from our tradition, more of a social democratic tradition, looks at looks at the regulator, how the regulator is now marketed and semi-privatised. That's the same ideas as profit and loss. And actually even going back to the late Blair government, a chap called David Hinchcliffe, who you might have heard, other people, there was arguing actually had the links between the regulator and pharma and everything, all sorts of difficulties there. So really, I want to argue that pushback. And also, there's no actual proper evidence. Some report out today about antidepressants actually not really working, and there's no real concrete evidence. I'm not against people taking it if it makes people feel better. Somebody said I can use this, who's in Wigan, said they were put on sertraline, which is antidepressant, and said it's the best capsule drug going. What he did, he went to work, and any bully, anything else, everything was just a phase. It just zonked him out. He said it was fantastic for capitalism. He never grown, the trouble is it affected the rest of his life as well. But it was a fantastic drug for capitalism. Don't blame the bosses, because you're just so out of it that actually in the end, everything just goes over your head. In some respects, it can work in them. There was big genetic studies, the human genome and everything else. But ironically, I can't remember. I think it was Blair, or Blair was with I can't remember which president was talking up to at the time, but basically it was always this human gene that's going to find the gene which is going to create schizophrenia. And actually they did all these studies and found it far more complicated than when they first started. So the situation became quite complicated. In fact, there's more evidence now that the relationship between the brain and trauma and everything else, one directly affects the other. Actually, there is no common necessary cause. Oh Jesus, I've got not much time. I'm missing on here. So really, I'll just let him go. I'll miss stuff out of it because I just want to talk about some of the psychological things, psychological ideas, and some of the well-being ideas. And there is something called mental health first aiders, which is massive now. I don't know if you've heard of that. One of my arguments is that people, in fact, I observe this, I think some people here are in that. I was reading David's arguments that some of the people are so distressed in the services trying to give the service to help people because it's so target driven, trying to prove that it works, and so short for many people, that they suffer some of the most highest levels of mental illness than a lot of the people who are actually coming to see them. I don't know whether that is true, but that's what David argues, and people here maybe correct me all right, really. But on the other hand, it's all about getting people out of the workplace. It's all about actually, hold on a minute, it's not your boss, it's not your workload. Actually, if you put you on this course, go and get a bit of counselling, and in the end, you'll be okay. You know, forget well-being is all about maybe going to bike ride, like bike riding, and everything else. But in the end, it's an individual. It's your fault. It's the individual's problem. Mental health is all about you, your problem, not society or anything else. And when it comes to young people, I mean, it's an absolute disgrace. I mean, many young people have been referred to mental health services. A study done in 2018 asked people what was the most stressful issue as far as mental distress is concerned. Actually, trauma now affects people quite a lot of evidence. Trauma affects young people and around that, and poverty and divorce. But when the question was asked by the NHS in 2018, what did most young people say was the most stressful thing for them?
Exams.
Not professional.
Education.
No, it was basically, people get it. It's basically the most stressing, upsetting, harmful pressure affecting mental distress was just pressure of school exams, tests, and increasing competition. And that was from young people themselves. So this idea, this thing about the workplace, the production line happens in schools as well. So what I want to finish off is all that chaos there, if you like. I want to finish off with, in a way, a lot of hope, because even within all that, people are doing their best within service. Usually the best service is, but the best thing you do is try and get around the system, or all the research shows, it don't matter what therapy you're getting, it's the relationship is the issue, and it's all about what is happening with the work process and audits and everything else. It shifts that relationship away, so you don't have time to build relationships up, and it's become a real problem. What evidence shows, relationship is the biggest thing in mental health. I want to just talk about mental health itself. I mean, Stephen Rose talks about determinisms, that we can't just say it's social, we can't just say it's medical. It's a dialectical relationship between the two within time. So the brain is a social thing, it actually transforms itself with the environment and other things. So there's a relationship between the two, and as Marxists, I think that's the sort of way forward we need to look at. And also I think we need to look at Marx's concept of alienation. Marx, when he talks about alienation, is that the worker has no control of what he produces. The second aspect, that human beings collectively work together, we create everything around us, like these rooms. The problem is that we never see the fruits of this labour, it's owned by somebody else. And the third aspect is competition itself, that catches filters down there, people blame everybody else. But actually, what does break that? Fighting back breaks that. The RM2 breaks that. So it gives me some hope. And people coming together, having extensive rebellion, having service users, having a meeting where RM2, mental health workers, service users are learning off each other, coming together to fight this system which creates that. I would argue, creates a gap where we can learn off each other to maybe even get better mental health mental health services. In fact, Colin Barker, people might know this, but basically I always like it. Colin Barker was a member here of the SWP, did a study on solidarity, and he said as workers grew in confidence in the revolution in the early 80s, the regime supporters became afraid that they were losing grip on power. The asylums emptied of workers who wanted to be part of the struggle and started to be filled up with party bureaucrats and bosses. Well, I'd like to put some of these people who are on the TV for having this debate in the asylum, you know what I mean? Because I think they deserve to be there, some of the rubbish they're actually coming out with. And other studies, there's another study actually quite interesting that I found actually came out 3 months ago, which people might know. It's basically, it's a study in the Journal of Epidemiology, I would say that. But the study's authors contend to really understand mental health. The study's authors contend to really understand mental health. That said, what you have to do is look under the hood. Obviously, it's an American study, and they're based in Chicago. At the process that gives rise to social-economic stratification to begin with, exploitation. To that end, researchers sought to measure the relationship between mental illness and the degree of exploitation defined as the value produced by a worker's labour that is not returned to that worker. And it found a strong relationship between the two, a massively strong relationship between the two. The more the workers exploited, the more they felt they had mental distress and mental illness, which actually comes to our tradition more than some of the other traditions. And I thought that was quite an interesting study. So really, I've missed loads out and everything else. It's probably on Fridays, and I'm going to wind up and getting totally wound up. But the issue is, I just want to say, is actually, I think, to actually be part of them all, to be on demonstrations, make you feel better, to watch a debate, to watch these two arguing one another, the most horrible individuals talking about taking away any bit of humanity got left, is awful. And they are not going to change. If it's inequality, exploitation, which causes mental health. In the last year, but there's 6 more billionaires being created in this country, 6 more. And when it comes to the Trussell Trust, 2.1 million food parcels have been sent out in the last year. There's now 177 billionaires. But that doesn't, you've got to grasp that really. You have to look, I looked at how do you work that out. So I changed it to seconds. So I'll change pounds to seconds, right? So 1 million seconds, given to pounds, is 12 days, right? 1 billion seconds is 31.5 years. That's the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. In the next 2 years, it looks like we're going to have a first trillionaire. That's what the Guardian was saying yesterday. The first trillionaire. How many years do you think a trillion is? Who's good at maths? I'm not good at maths. And that's the worst thing you could do with it, because it's going to create so many mental health problems that like maths.
You add 3 numbers.
Yeah, what you do basically is a trillion. So it's 30. So a trillionaire, equivalent to seconds, compared to a million, which is 12 days, is 31,688 years, which is longer than human existence itself. When they say there's no money and they're going to cut corporation tax, no wonder it gets to our heads if you look at it like that. And I want to finish off when you say there's 640.7 million antidepressants given out. World Health Organization says work is good for your mental health. Then points out that $1 trillion a year in production is lost due to anxiety and depression. I would say work is totally detrimental to your mental health. And I think actually the best way forward is what and service users movement coming together with all ourselves on the, and I think in the end, I think we should take it from the climate change movement. In the end, what really is going to change mental distress for everybody else is system change. As we say in climate change, I think it's exactly the same thing, because actually I do not think actually in the end capitalism will actually really get down to what really is our distress and everything else. And I think only in a fairer or equal society you can really find out what really is the complex and difficulty. So I think to get a better mental health, you have to have a system change.